All right, so since we just finished first semester, I mean, it's a great time to take a look at how our points calculated. You know, when you go into your grade book and you see that displayed percentage within a category, where does that come from? And at the most basic level, it's just taking how much you earned out of how much was possible. And we're going to be finding a percent based on that information. And so whenever you do one of these calculations, we always calculate a percent by doing earned divided by possible. And so if percents have given you trouble in the past, you might want to make note of that we're always going to do earned divided by, or over if you prefer writing as a fraction, possible. And it's very natural talking those terms in this particular problem because there's actually points earned and points possible. Sometimes you kind of got to rephrase the question just a little bit in order to be able to see the same relevance. But if you think about it in these ways, you'll always be able to figure it out. All right, so that means in this case then, we're going to start by doing 368, because that was how many points we earned, divided by the 500, which is points possible. And so now it's just a calculator piece, right? So break out the calculator, and when you do that, that gives you 0.736. But while that number is a very useful number, it's not actually the percent, right? Because if we only earned 0.736%, we did really poorly. But we can put this into a percent. Do you remember the rule for how we turn a decimal into a percent like this? Yeah. Exactly, yeah, we multiply it by 100. So you then are going to do 0.736 times 100. Which, by the way, you could do in your head. You don't even need a calculator for it if you know a little trick. Because anytime you multiply by a factor of 10, that is a 1 with a bunch of zeros after it, you move the decimal over from where it is over that many places. So you notice in this case then, it moves over 2 places. So it's going to become 73.6. And so in this case where we're multiplying by 100, move the decimal over 2 places because there's 2 zeros here. If we were multiplying by 1,000, yeah, you'd move the decimal over 3 places. If you're multiplying by 10, you'd move the decimal over 1 place. Now you can still use your calculator, but the more you're able to do this stuff mentally, the more it'll help you out. In fact, we'll even take some time dealing just with the mental math side of it here a little bit later. But then in the end for this one, our final answer is that in their test category at least, this person ended up with 73.6% as their grade. Yeah, and every time we want to take a decimal like this and turn it into a percent, it's always going to be times 100. Every single time. And in fact, that's the sort of thing that's probably worth making note of. So, into your math notes, if you didn't know that right off the top of your head and very quickly, or if you're prone to forget it, as many of us are, write this down, please. All right, so now we're going to take another look at a problem here. This is actually a very typical one. This is the sort of thing that you'll encounter if you just go to the mall. You know, there's something that you want to buy. In this case, it's a shirt that's $45. Sales tax is about 10%. And yeah, that's a nice rule of thumb to use around here. In a few places, it's below that. In a lot of places around here, it's just over 10%. But if you calculate it with 10%, you can do some mental math and actually come up with some stuff quickly off the top of your head that'll help on those. And so we want to know how much are we going to pay in tax for this shirt. So if we're going to be able to figure this one out, the first thing I got to do is actually take my percent and turn it into a number that I can do math with. And that's the tricky thing about percents for a lot of people, is because we're never going to multiply or divide by the percent itself. We always have to change it into a number. Now, in order to get a percent, remember we multiplied by 100? And so if I start with a percent and I want to turn it into a number, I take my percent and I divide it by 100. And again, there's a mental math technique that you can use with this. When you multiply by 100, we move the decimal over to the right 2 places. If you divide by 100, you're actually going to move the decimal over 2 places to the left, which is going to give us then an answer here of 0.1. And now, you can write it as 0.10 if it makes you feel a little bit better, but of course 0.10 is the same as 0.1. We actually move the decimal over 2 places. But again, if you don't get that trick, that's okay. You can still punch it in your calculator and do 10 divided by 100 and get the 0.1. All right, now that I have it as a number, I now can actually do math with it. So that's the tricky thing with percent. You got to turn it into a number before you can do math. So if I want to know what 10% of 45 is, that means I'm going to take the 45 and my 0.1, and I got to do something to them. Now, whenever you can say the word of in a math problem, do you remember what that means? It means multiply. It's just one of those interesting things about how our language is used, but if you're trying to figure out some quantity of something, it's telling you to multiply. And so then I'm going to be doing 45 times my 0.1, which is going to give us 4.5. So that tells me then that we are going to have to pay 4.5 in tax. Now, we don't say how much you're going to have to pay. I'm going to have to pay 4.5. We say I'm going to have to pay $4.50. That's just writing it in terms of the money that it is. No math going on, going from here to here. It's just putting it in the way that we actually normally talk about it. Now, oftentimes these questions won't start by saying how much tax are you going to have to pay. Most of the time when you see questions like this, and when you're in the store looking at buying something, trying to figure out if you got enough money, usually the question is, how much am I going to have to pay total? And so that's our second question that we're going to look at here. All right, so since we know how much tax we have to pay and we know our original amount, basically all we have to do here is add them. And so I take my 45 and I add the $4.50. And so that gives us $49.50. And you'll notice in here, with a little bit of mental math tricks, which we're going to, again, come back to in a little while so you can get good at these, because I don't want you having to break out a calculator while you're out shopping. You can actually figure out some of these things really quickly and easily, which is a very good tool to have, because you don't want to get up to the cash register and all of a sudden realize you don't have enough to pay for it. That's not a fun experience. So in that problem, in order to calculate using the percent, we had to turn it into a number, so add this into those same notes. In order to calculate something with a percent, first divide it by 100 to turn it into a number. All right, so for this problem, we got a phone that costs $700. Yes, they're going to charge you tax on that too. And so in this particular example, we're going to use a percent of 10.5%. Fairly typical again. And so we want to know what the phone will actually cost us. That is, out the door, what are we going to have to pay on this thing? So first thing we have to do, in order to do calculations with this percent, I got to turn it into a number. So that means taking that 10.5 and the 100. Now, am I going to multiply or divide by 100 for this one? Yep, we start with a percent, so I'm going to divide by 100. And so that's going to give me 0.105 when I do that calculation. And again, you could use the trick of moving the decimal or actually type it in your calculator and get the number out. All right, now that I have that, I can now figure out what 10.5% of 700 is. Now notice how I phrased it there. I want to know what 10.5% of 700 is. That means I'm going to be multiplying. So we're going to do 700 times that 0.105. When we do that, we get 73.5. That's just punching in the calculator to get that number out. Right, now that I know that, is my answer then 73.50? Nope. Yeah, we still have to add it in, because remember, that's just the amount of the tax. always think about, what does this number represent? When you're dealing with something that represents real life, you should be able to describe it in terms of real life. So I now take the 700 and I add the 73.5 to that. When we do so, we end up with $773.50. So be planning for this sort of thing, of course, when you've got a major purchase on the horizon. It's easy to think, okay, these phones cost $700. I just got to save up $700. Then you go in to buy it and you get that big surprise of, oh yeah, there's tax. Always be thinking about, what's that tax going to cost you? Because they're going to make you pay it. It's good for you to at least know what to expect on it. All right, so now this is another common type of situation that you hit out in the world, where you go to a restaurant and you want to tip the server. Yes, tip the server. Those of you who are working as servers in restaurants get what I'm talking about, right? Yes. They're working hard. Help them out. And of course, it varies. Lots of people have different philosophies about how much they tip. But 15% is a common idea, so I'm going with 15% on this particular example. And so when we say a 15% tip, that tip is based on the actual bill amount. So you're going to come up and look and see, okay, on the receipt that they give you, what's the final amount? We want to add 15% to that as our tip to our server in this problem. So then, in order to do this work, first thing we got to do is take our 15% and make it into a number that we can calculate with. So that means I'm going to take my 15% and my 100, and am I going to multiply or divide? Divide. Yep, we're going to divide here. And so that gives us 0.15. All right, now that I've got that, I now need to figure out what 15% of the 3360 is. And if I want to figure out what that percent of it is, that means multiply. So I'm going to multiply it by the 0.15. And that gives us, when we actually do that calculation, 5.04. So in this case, then, it gets $5.04. Is that our final answer on this one? Well, actually it is our final answer, because the question here was, how much should we add for the tip? So this is the actual tip amount. Now, for me, if I'm doing this, I'm probably paying with cash. I'm probably rounding it to $5 when I actually go and do this. You know, I tend to just round it to something easy to just leave as cash on there. But by doing this, you know about what the right amount is, so that you can do that. Or if you are paying with a card or something, you can actually add in the exact 5.04 there. Now, I often will pay with cash, especially at restaurants and such. And so, like, this is a common type of situation. The bill comes to $52.32. I look at my wallet, I discover I've got 3 20s. So I'm just going to figure, okay, I'm trying to make my life easier and just put down $60. Is that going to be a reasonable amount for the tip here? Or am I like way over tipping or under tipping them here? So I actually want to calculate this out. How much tip, what percent of a tip are we leaving in this case? So if I want to figure out what percent I left as a tip, the first step in this case would mean knowing how much money did we leave as a tip. Well, and of course, that would be whatever the difference is between the 52.32 and the 60. And so we do the subtraction, we can figure out that we have left a $7.68 tip in this kind of a case. Now we need to know what that is as a percent. So we're trying to figure out 7.68 is what percent of 52.32? Well, in order to do that, this is where we actually start by just dividing the numbers. We don't need to involve the 100 yet. So I'm going to do 768 divided by the 52.32. That is the earned divided by possible kind of formula that we did on that very first calculation. We take the amount that we're leaving in this case and divide it by what we started with. When we do this calculation, it gives us about 0.1468. Now, obviously, we didn't leave 0.1468%, right? But that is the number. So if this is the number, what do I do to it to make it into a percent? Multiply by 100. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract those. And so the final answer ends up being that we left a tip of about 14.68%. I'm feeling pretty good about that. I'm feeling like this is pretty close to 15% based on what I could just lay down for the bill pretty quick and easy. So I'm feeling okay about that. Now that we've pushed our brains a little bit with some of these percents when it comes to some of these monetary things, I'm going to bring it back to a very familiar context. Actually, the context we started with. When your grades are calculated, they're graded based on certain percents. And really what happens in your grade, where we balance your grade by different categories, is we look at each of those categories and then combine the percents. You don't combine just the total points. It's not like we're just going to add up the points possible and add up the points earned and that's your final one in here. Because we break down our grades by weighted percents we talked about. So what you actually need to know is what are the percent values for each of these categories. So we're going to figure that out for this example. As you're doing these, remember that idea of earned divided by possible. So like checking in that you got the right start here. For the test category, we want to take the number of points earned and divide it by the number of points possible. But when you do that, that's just going to give us 0.65. That's not the percent, right? So I take the 0.65, multiply that by 100. Now notice on these, a little bit of a note on rounding. When you do the calculation for the quiz category, if you were thinking ahead to rounding your answer and you said, okay, I got 0.8845, well, I want to round my answer to just 2 decimal places, and so you just stop there and then multiply by 100, you would just get 88%. But always round only at the very end. And so you don't want to round in the middle like that. You would use the entire decimal, so leave it up on your calculator and say times 100, then round that answer. So one way of dealing with percents, and one reason why we need to deal with percents, is it allows us to break down individual categories of things into their own representations that then we can combine. And we'll worry about combining these into a final grade later. We're going to be doing percents of percents in that case, and I don't want to throw that in quite yet. I want to save that. Another way that we end is for doing comparisons. So we can also use it for comparisons. So take a look at this situation. We want to figure out which of these students did the best on tests. Right, now in order to do this, hopefully you saw based on the work we've been doing so far that you're going to want to calculate percents for each of these people. Because just looking at the raw numbers, it's hard to compare them and see who has been doing the best. But if you find the percent for each one, then it's much easier to compare them. It's basically putting it all into the same format, which then allows comparisons to take place. It's actually the same idea behind a common denominator and fractions, too, if you want to think about it that way. So, for instance, for that first one, to find Michael's percent on tests, we do 400 divided by 600, gives us 0.6 repeating, and multiply that by 100 to get our percent. And so that's what Michael's percent would look like. Go ahead and find the rest of those percents, please. All right, and then you continue from there doing the same thing. Take points earned divided by points possible, multiply it by 100, and here are all the final percents that you should have found. And then once we see this, we can tell who's doing well and who's not doing well on the tests. As your teachers are looking at their grades, as we look at a whole class worth of grades, this is the type of thing we're looking for. We're looking at percents, because if we just look at points earned, it can be a bit deceptive because it depends on how many points were possible for that student. Did we excuse a quiz that's not counted in there or something like that? And so by looking at the percents, we get a really good idea about how somebody is doing. It tells us a lot more information. Now, as you look down this list, well, if we want to know who did the best on tests, which is the question this one's asking for, looks like the highest percent is right here. So it looks like Trevor has done the best. Michael, unfortunately, looks like he's done the worst so far.